Hello and welcome back. As I mentioned in a previous video, I am challenging myself to read all of Shakespeare's plays. Obviously not in the immediate future, but it's a long-term goal of mine. I've currently read 27 of them. One thing you may be aware of is that Shakespeare's plays, and plays from that era in general, fell into several different categories or genres. These were tragedy, comedy, and history. So today I'm going to be talking about these different genres and my experience reading from them. If you've read only one kind of play by Shakespeare, I would guess that it was a tragedy, because most of the ones that students read in high school are tragedies, like Romeo and Juliet and Hamlet, for instance. Tragedy isn't really just as simple as it ends tragically, although that definitely is a big part of it, and the tragedies do end tragically. Really, what tragedy boils down to in the sense of classic literature that's considered tragedy is usually that the hero has a tragic flaw that leads to their downfall. This is a tradition that was really important in ancient Greece, but it's also the case in Shakespeare's tragedies. For example, Hamlet is very well known for his indecision, Othello for his jealousy, and Macbeth for being susceptible to manipulation. I also wanted to mention that although the tragedies end tragically, as one might expect, they're not all doom and gloom. Usually there is some kind of hope at the end and a re-establishment of the normal order of things. For example, at the end of Romeo and Juliet, the two lovers are dead, but their feuding families reconcile. Tragedy was, for a long time, the only genre of Shakespeare that I had read. And when reading them, you really do get the impression that Shakespeare's plays tend to have a high body count and tend to be very serious and frankly depressing. But that's not always the case. The comedies are pretty much the polar opposite of that. Typically, the comedies are very lighthearted and tend to focus on romance. Not that the tragedies don't involve romance. I mean, Romeo and Juliet very famously does. But in the comedies, they get their happily ever after. They are usually pretty funny, but that's not what makes them a comedy in the traditional sense. And the humor that they involve isn't usually like slapstick type humor or anything like that. It's much more likely actually to be clever wordplay or silly misunderstandings. Needless to say, there are some stories that don't fit very clearly into the categories of comedy or tragedy. In the modern day, there definitely are. For instance, The Lord of the Rings comes to mind as an example of a story that's more serious and involves a lot of heavy themes and difficult situations, but ultimately ends on a very positive, uplifting note and doesn't involve the death of the majority of the main characters. This is not as new as one might think looking at these old genres, because Shakespeare did the same thing. Some of his plays have much heavier, more serious themes and situations that might seem typical of a tragedy, but that ultimately have more of a happy ending, or at least not a tragic ending with a lot of death and bloodshed. Plays that fit this description are sometimes categorized as tragicomedies, romances, or problem plays. Those aren't all synonymous, but they all kind of define different aspects of that in between. For example, a problem play usually dealt with a problem in society. I read Measure for Measure recently, and that's a great example of a problem play. It deals very heavily with themes like hypocrisy, corruption, and abuse of power. Ultimately, the tragedy is averted, but through circumstances that are more serious than comic. Another play that blends the genres together is The Tempest. While it has its lighthearted moments, The Tempest can be a pretty serious play, but ultimately, everything works out for the best. Prospero forgives his enemies, Miranda and Ferdinand are married, Ariel is freed, and they all live happily ever after. So all of those serious themes being explored throughout the play, they ultimately don't lead to a tragic conclusion, but the whole thing is a lot heavier and more serious than you would expect from a traditional comedy. The Tempest is usually classified as a tragicomedy or a romance. And then finally, while most of the plays do take place in a historical time period, there's a specific grouping categorized as the history plays. That would be the Henry and Richard plays for the most part, also King John. These plays are inspired by medieval British history, and they deal with the rise and fall of important historical monarchs. Sometimes there's crossover with tragedies, Like, I know that Richard II and Richard III are also classified as tragedies sometimes. And there's even a little bit of crossover with comedies. Like, for instance, I have not read The Merry Wives of Windsor, but I know that a supporting character from the Henry IV plays is the lead character in The Merry Wives of Windsor, which is a comedy. Personally, I really enjoy the history plays, but they are a little bit of an acquired taste and read very differently from the comedies or tragedies, even when there is some crossover into those categories. They're a lot more concerned with historical battles and politics. One thing that I hope has come across in this video is that there is a huge variety within the different categories of plays that Shakespeare wrote. There are the tragedies that deal with serious themes and follow the downfall of a tragic hero. There are the comedies, which are lighthearted and usually involve romance. There are the tragicomedies and problem plays, which blur the lines between the two, and the histories, which deal with, at least very loosely based on real history. I was surprised when I started reading more of these plays on my own, just what a wide variety there was, and how different they can be from each other. Some, like Much Ado About Nothing, for instance, reads like a modern-day romantic comedy, whereas others are very, very different from anything that you would find in the modern day. Personally, I'm very partial to the histories and the tragicomedy problem play gray area, but there are plays that I like in all of the categories. Which ones are your favorites? Let me know in the comments down below. And if you liked this, be sure to subscribe. I post videos twice a week.